at the risk of being personal, I think it's important that you have one example of one way the charism worked in my case. As a baby of 6, I became a boarding student at the Trenton, New Jersey Diocesan Mother House of the Sisters of Mercy. That was September 1941. And I graduated from there, having been a boarder for 11 years, in June 1952. I went from the first half of 3rd to the second half of 4th grade, but anyway, bad move. But anyway, you see my point. At graduation, my 2 best friends then entered the Sisters of Mercy novitiate, right there, in another part of the campus. My father became aware of this and said there was no way that I was going to Georgian Court, which was the Mercy, and still is, the Mercy College associated with the Trenton Sisters of Mercy. So, my parents sent me to Marymount. Ultimately a bad move from my father's perspective. And we had a tradition at the Mount, not Marymount, Mount St. Mary's, that the just graduated class of 1952 returned to the Mount to play basketball, which was our big sport, December, in the first week of December. So I returned to my Mount St. Mary's that December for a traditional basketball game between alumni and varsity, and told my best friend, Mercy Postulants, that I was going to enter the Rshm on February 2nd. So much for keeping me away from religious life, and so much for getting the charism right. The charism I was meant to espouse was not what I had thought. It was another one. Spirituality is a term that gets thrown around and has many interpretations. Wikipedia says spirituality lacks a definitive definition. I don't know. Although social scientists have defined spirituality as the search for the sacred. Another internet source says that trying to define spirituality, here's another one of those definitions, is attempting to define the indefinable. But all the descriptions of spirituality seem to include the idea of the ongoing endeavor to grow in our relationship with God. In order to talk about growing in relationship with God, we need to ask, who is that God, and what are the steps in developing a relationship? For Gailhac, and therefore for us, the question becomes, how do we, quote, follow Jesus Christ in the Rshm tradition? So on February 2nd, 1953, barely knowing that the habit was blue because the nuns always had their black aprons on, I entered the novitiate at Tarrytown and began this great adventure. And it finds me now celebrating 60 years of religious profession. I began hearing some of Gailhac's letters in the novitiate, and later on in community enrichment for 2 years. I was not enthralled. They were not page turners for me. And while I had no doubt about my religious vocation, I was hardly then inspired by the founders' letters. I found them harsh, maybe because I was 19. Then in 1956, I received a Viedu mission to Marymount Maid. Alas, Rosian lecture, as we used to know it, was in English, so no change in the letters. Same old, same old. Then in 1959, during the summer I was to make the final vows, my 30-day retreat was at the Mother House. What a change in spirituality, and no daily letters. Just an invitation from Mère Jeanne d'Arc Lefebvre, the mistress of novices and tertians as well, to read selectively from French spiritual writers, including the founder, oh, he's a French spiritual writer. That was a great change. I began to see him in a new light and also in French. It was still before Vatican II, so there was great liturgical correctness in celebrating final vows on exactly the feast of the day in the order. So no room for Sacred Heart of Mary or any kind of Marian celebration. We made our perpetual profession on August 29th, the feast of the beheading of John the Baptist. We were to take joy in the delight that the priest was using the founder's red, I might say blood red too, vestments. And he had an enthusiastic homily extolling the analogy between John the Baptist's fate and ours if we were faithful. My mother was there. And I was so glad that she could not understand a word of it. She just smiled all the way through. That wasn't the end. I remember we then had rabbit for lunch. My day was complete. So in 1959, I had my first taste of the founder in French. And I remember beginning to read more about him in French. I began to put him in the context of his time, in French history, and much more. Just an aside, when you get the handouts, the first part of the handouts will show you the chaotic 100 years of the 19th century French, just in case you're not familiar with, as most people wouldn't be. All right? Well, in 1990, I celebrated with gusto the bicentenary of Gaillac's death. And I frankly nagged our dear Laetitia, who was provincial at the time, to go to the Mother House for the 150th celebration, which was truly international and wonderful. But it wasn't until an invitation came from Marjorie Keenan in 2005 to be part of a group from the Northern European province, the Western American province, Mary Milligan, and the Eastern American province to translate into English a trove of about 200 of the founder's letters that I became a student. No, a fan of Gailhac. These letters had been put into Portuguese, but not yet into English. By the way, if you wonder how many letters the founder wrote, think about this. He had 40 years of religious life, about 1840, well, 4950, right?
Yeah.
To 90. And certainly the last 2 or 3 years. So, but let's give the ballpark 40 years. He wrote most of his letters after the death of the foundress. Obviously, we have a whole book that Mary did of the letters to the foundress, all right? But for the most part, they're written after her death. So most of the letters from 1870 to 1888, 89, so 20 years. Can you guess how many? 800.
Okay.
So see, you haven't read them all. They're about 800, which is really amazing. And what I think is amazing is that we have so many of them because he was known in Béziers, as much as there are periods, and I'm going to do that period, when he was the scorn of the town. He was still considered a holy man during his life. And in the journal in Béziers, he's called an homme de foi, you know, a man of faith. So he, even though he goes through one terrible period, the persecutions you heard of that nobody described to us what exactly they were. He was recognized as a holy man in his town, not unlike the cura d'Els. Anyway, so you were right to wonder how I could all of a sudden kind of become a fan. Were they not the same old letters? They were. But our job, the 2 years we do this, was not only to translate them into English, but to add their context. Now, there was a book that was published. It doesn't have all of them. It is called the Blue Book. Everybody didn't get this, all right? But all of them, Mary did this with Rosa de Carmel. And the context, she did all the context. And so, but they weren't put with the letters themselves. So we took what we could and put them into 2 volumes. All right? So it had been done in Portuguese by a team of 10 in Portugal in 2000. So this is relatively new. Sisters Rosa de Carmel and Mary Milligan wrote a brief commentary on each letter, putting it into as intelligible a context as they were able after 100 years. It was a 2-year process for our group just to translate them into the context. And we met first at the Mother House for 10 days the summer after the invitations went out. We worked in country groups, Portugal, England and Ireland, and the US, actually Sag Harbor. For most of each day, returning together a couple of times, but definitely after Gute, to report on progress or lack thereof, discoveries and the like. So there were 7 of us tearing these letters apart, or saying that will work in England and Ireland. This won't work in the United States, because remember we're doing British and American English, so what we're trying to do is come up with something which will go for everyone. We benefited greatly from the presence of Mary Milligan that first summer, as well as Bernadette McNamara being there and Andre Dulligan, right? But we also knew, unfortunately, we probably would not see Mary the second summer because of the increasingly developing symptoms of her illness. In the meantime, during the 2 winters between the summer meetings at the Mother House, we each worked on about 20 or 30 letters. And that may not seem like a lot. Believe me, it was. Because you have teaching, homework, papers, all that. While it was often difficult to work at home, all right, it was great to be able to spend each February break of those 2 years at Seagirt. And Margaret Morrissey and I would go together because we never saw things the same way, as friendly as we are. We both corrected each other or made suggestions, especially in trying to make the letters contemporary, yet without slang, or anything that would be really objectionable language, and that's hard to do. The results of this work are in the 2 volumes published in 2011, titled Letters of the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, Volume 1, From the Beginning to 1878, and Volume 2, 1878 to 89. There are 793 letters, all right, 18 undated, only about 68 of which are written before 1870. So the man took to his desk and started writing after the founders died. Meanwhile, Mary gave us the small book this, and then the other one that she picked up the wrong book, that's not really good, that she translated of the letters of Mother St. John with the responses from Father Gailhac. And that is a gem. If you really want to look at the relationship, that's where it is. I think many times that Père Gailhac cannot be fully understood as our founder until we clearly understand him as a human being. And the life of this human being, so important to our religious existence, cannot really be appreciated without the context of the times in which he lived and worked. Change and complexity come to mind when reflecting on 19th century France, and tumultuous doesn't even begin to describe what was happening. Chaotic might be a better word. Historical and political changes were paramount in the years that Gailhac lived, from 1802 until he died, 1890, most of that century.